It happened in less than 5 seconds, but those 5 seconds would stain the air of Redmond Secondary forever. The sound of laughter, clinking glassware, and teenage chatter collapsed into a silence so deep you could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. A beaker rolled off a desk and shattered, and in that small sound the entire class seemed to realize what they had just witnessed. Brandon Cole, 6 feet of privilege, swagger, and arrogance, had just called his black teacher a word no classroom should ever hear. The insult didn't come as a shout. It slipped out like a joke, like something rehearsed in locker room whispers, and that made it worse. The kind of word that carried centuries of weight disguised behind a crooked grin. His friends laughed, the way boys laugh when cruelty is entertainment and consequences are myths. But when Leona Daniels turned toward him, the laughter died mid-breath. She didn't yell. She didn't even move fast. She just looked at him, steady, calm, and heartbreakingly disappointed. That look didn't belong to a schoolteacher. It belonged to someone who had seen men in uniform crumble under fire and still kept her pulse steady. Her voice came quiet but sharp enough to slice through the silence. "Say that again," she said. Brandon froze, but pride was louder than fear. He leaned back in his chair and smirked. "I was just saying you people get worked up too easily." His tone was dripping with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no. There was a sound barely audible, a student's breath catching. A few eyes darted toward the door, as if escape might somehow wash away what they'd just heard. Everyone had seen Brandon push teachers before. He'd mocked the math teacher's accent, made the history substitute cry, and once recorded a janitor sweeping the halls just to caption it, "Know your place." No one ever said anything because everyone knew his father, Councilman Cole. Money bought silence and silence bought power. But Leona Daniels wasn't silence. She set the piece of chalk down carefully, wiped her hands on her slacks and stepped forward. "Stand up," she said. Her voice was low but iron-edged. The class watched, frozen between fear and awe. Brandon hesitated, but his friends were watching, and his smirk returned. "Why? You gonna teach me some manners?" The question was soaked in mockery, but beneath his grin was the flicker of something uncertain. Leona's presence carried weight. A kind of stillness that made even laughter sound disrespectful. She didn't move closer. She didn't need to. "You think power is in your mouth," she said. "But real power is in how you choose to use it." That line hung in the air. It wasn't a quote from a textbook. It was the kind of sentence that burns itself into memory. For a long second no one spoke. The sunlight streaming through the windows hit her face just enough to catch the thin scar along her temple, one most had never noticed before. She looked like someone who had seen storms and walked through them dry. Brandon folded his arms, refusing to look away. "You think you scare me because you talk fancy?" he spat. "You're just another woman lucky to have this job. My dad pays people like you." There it was again, the venom wrapped in entitlement. A few of the students flinched, the others sat motionless, afraid to breathe wrong. The racial sting of his words filled the room like smoke, invisible but choking. Leona's expression didn't change. She could have sent him to the principal. She could have shouted, demanded an apology. Instead, she did something far more disarming. She smiled. Not a kind smile. An almost sorrowful one. The kind that makes you realize you've just stepped into a fight you can't win. "I've met men with power," she said quietly. "And I've buried friends who died because of men like them. Sit down before you learn what real respect costs." The words weren't a threat. They were truth. And the way she said them made the hair on every student's arm rise. There was something in her tone, something disciplined, controlled, dangerous, like the sound of a trigger being cocked. Brandon opened his mouth to retort, but the bell rang, and the sound cracked through the tension like thunder. No one moved. No one packed up. Every student's eyes were fixed on her, as if they were seeing her for the first time, not as a teacher, but as something larger, something untouchable. When she finally turned back to the board, her shoulders straight, her posture flawless, the silence remained. Even Brandon didn't move for a moment. His smirk had slipped, replaced by something closer to confusion. He didn't know it yet, but that moment, the one he thought he controlled, was the beginning of his unraveling. He had poked a storm he couldn't understand. Because Leona Daniels wasn't just another teacher trying to survive a long semester. She was a woman who had already survived a war. By the next morning, Redmond Secondary was humming like a beehive shaken from sleep. Students whispered in corridors, teachers spoke in cautious tones, and even the janitor paused mid-sweep when he heard the name Miss Daniels. Some swore she'd threatened Brandon, others said she'd cried after he left the room. But those who had been there, the ones who saw her stand like stone while a racist remark echoed off the lab walls, knew neither rumor was true. Leona Daniels hadn't threatened or cried. She had simply looked at him, and somehow that was worse. By lunch, Brandon Cole had already twisted the story. At his table, surrounded by friends, he smirked as he said, "She thinks she's better than me. Probably from some tough neighborhood where everyone acts like they're heroes." His voice dripped with mock sympathy. His friends laughed too loudly, but beneath it, even they seemed uneasy. No one forgot the way her voice carried in that classroom, the kind of quiet that makes you rethink your arrogance. Leona walked through the cafeteria that day, shoulders straight, lunch tray in hand, eyes forward. Students hushed as she passed. She could feel their stares, their curiosity, their judgment, their unease. It wasn't the first time she'd felt it. She'd felt it years ago too, in places where soldiers measured one another not by skin but by scars. She took a slow breath and kept walking, her composure unbroken. In the staff room, the teachers were no better. "She should have reported him," one whispered. "That boy's family could cause trouble." Another said, "You know who his father is, right? Councilman Cole. She needs to be careful." They said it like advice, but what they really meant was, "Stay silent, survive the year." Leona listened quietly, then excused herself before the bitterness in her throat could turn into words. She had spent too many years biting back what she really wanted to say. That evening, the sun bled orange over the parking lot as she locked her classroom door. Her reflection in the window stared back at her, a woman in her mid-30s with a calm face and eyes that had seen too much. She pressed a hand against the cool glass and whispered to herself, "You didn't come here to fight wars anymore." But the truth settled heavily on her chest. Racism had many forms. Some wore uniforms. Others wore blazers and smiled politely as they told you where you didn't belong. At home, her apartment was small but neat. Photographs lined the mantel, most of them faded, sun-washed from years of light. One showed a group of soldiers in desert gear, grinning beside a transport truck. Another showed a young woman, her years younger, standing between two men in uniform, medals glinting on their chests. Both of those men were gone now, lost to an ambush that still visited her dreams. She had left the military believing she could teach peace, not realizing that prejudice didn't end with gunfire. It just changed its language. That night, she sat by her kitchen window, watching the streetlights flicker through the rain. The faces of her students floated in her mind, the nervous ones who avoided eye contact, the ones who laughed too loudly when Brandon mocked her, the ones who didn't know whether to help or hide. She thought of how easily silence grows roots. She'd seen it on battlefields too, people waiting for someone else to act. She had promised herself she wouldn't be that kind of person again. At the same time, Brandon lay in his king-sized bed scrolling through messages. His friends were texting him versions of the story that made him the victim. "She's crazy, bro thinks she's some soldier or something. Bet she gets fired." His ego swelled with each message, but under the surface something itched. He kept seeing her eyes. How they didn't flinch. How she didn't back away. There was something in that look that unsettled him more than her words ever could. The next day, the whispers followed Leona like shadows. When she entered her classroom, conversations stopped. But this time there was something else in their silence, curiosity, even respect. They were seeing her differently now, though none of them could explain why. It wasn't just because she stood her ground. It was because she had done it without raising her voice, without losing her dignity. Halfway through class, she caught Brandon staring at her again, his expression unreadable. She ignored it and continued teaching. But her heartbeat was heavy with a mix of resolve and sadness. She knew this wasn't over. People like Brandon didn't back down easily. Entitlement rarely surrendered without one last strike. When the final bell rang, she gathered her papers slowly, waiting for the last of the students to leave. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and chalk dust. She exhaled, long and tired, and looked out at the empty desks. There was a loneliness to teaching that no one talked about, the kind that comes when you pour yourself into a room that might never understand you. Outside, rain began to fall again. It drummed softly against the windows, washing away the day's noise. But somewhere inside her, an old instinct stirred. The same one that once told her when danger wasn't finished yet. The same one that saved her life more than once. She had thought she'd left that part of herself behind. She was wrong. By Thursday morning, the unease at Redmond Secondary had turned into something darker. You could feel it in the hallways, in the way laughter died when Miss Daniels passed by, in the way Brandon's friends nudged each other with that smirk that meant trouble was coming. Rain streaked across the windows, turning the sky a dull gray, and every sound in the building seemed louder. The slam of lockers, the squeak of sneakers, the murmur of gossip feeding on itself. Leona Daniels felt the tension before she even entered her classroom. Years of instinct made her sense it like a shift in the wind before a storm. She set her books down, took a breath, and began her lesson as though the air wasn't crackling with something waiting to ignite. Brandon Cole sat near the back, his chair tipped onto two legs, his phone face down but recording. The small red light blinked beneath his notebook, unseen by most but not by her. She noticed it though she said nothing. His friends grinned, whispering under their breath, nudging him to start. He'd been humiliated once and he wanted his revenge, his proof that she wasn't untouchable, that his father's name still meant something. The plan was simple. Make her lose control, catch it on camera, send it around the school. He'd be the victim again, and she'd be gone by Monday. As Leona moved between lab tables, explaining chemical reactions, Brandon raised his hand lazily. "Miss Daniels," he said, his voice smooth with mock respect. "Is it true what they're saying? That you used to be in the military? That why you act like we're all soldiers?" A few students laughed nervously. She didn't answer. She simply kept writing on the board. "Come on," he pressed louder now. "You can tell us. But you used to yell at your men like that, huh? Or maybe they didn't take orders from women either." The laughter that followed was sharper this time, edged with cruelty. Something in Leona's chest tightened, not from anger but from memory. She saw flashes, sandstorms, the glint of metal under sun, the sound of a young private's voice cracking through a radio begging for backup that never came. For a moment, she wasn't in a classroom. She was standing in the desert again, smoke thick in her throat, remembering what it felt like to lose someone because of arrogance. She gripped the chalk, steadied her breathing, and turned slowly. "Brandon," she said softly, "there are things in life you don't joke about. War is one of them. Respect is another." But he only smirked. "Respect? You have to earn that." His tone twisted the word until it sounded like a dare. He stood, knocking over his chair. "What's the matter, Miss Daniels? Gonna bark orders at me now? Show everyone how tough you are." The class fell completely silent. The rain outside seemed to stop. Every eye in the room was on them. She should have sent him out, called security, done anything else. But some instinct, old and buried, told her not to turn away. She had faced worse. She had survived men like him before, men who thought power came from noise and position. He moved closer, a cruel glint in his eyes, pretending to spill acid from a beaker onto her desk. A few students gasped. "Oops," he said. "Guess you should have taught us better." That was the moment she moved. It was almost impossible to follow what happened next. One heartbeat he was smirking, the next his wrist was caught midair, her hand gripping it like iron. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the room. His friends stood, shocked, as Brandon's smug expression twisted in pain. Leona's stance was steady, feet apart, posture balanced, movement precise. Her voice cut through the air like the snap of a command. "Enough." It wasn't anger that powered her voice. It was authority, the kind that silences chaos. For the first time, Brandon looked small, his breath short, eyes darting around the room for someone to save him. But no one moved. The students sat frozen, mesmerized by what they were seeing. She released his wrist slowly, the tension in her hand relaxing like a coiled spring unbound. "Sit down," she said again, and he did, this time without a word. The class stayed silent even after she resumed teaching, her voice calm as if nothing had happened. But everyone could feel it, the shift. The unspoken realization that their teacher was not someone you humiliated and walked away laughing. Her strength wasn't just physical. It was something deeper, older, carved from years of surviving disrespect, fear, and danger. As the bell rang, no one rushed to the door. They filed out quietly, glancing at her like they were leaving a sacred place. Brandon lingered, staring at his phone. The screen was cracked, the recording ruined. For once he had nothing to post, nothing to prove. Just silence. When he finally left, Leona sat alone for a moment, her hands trembling slightly on the desk. Not from fear, but from restraint. Every cell in her body wanted to forget the past she had buried, but it had risen again, uninvited. She pressed her palms together and whispered under her breath, "You promised yourself peace. Don't let them take it." But deep down, she knew peace didn't come easy to people like her. The next morning, the air in Redmond Secondary felt heavier, like the building itself was holding its breath. Word of what happened in the chemistry lab had spread beyond the school walls. Parents whispering, teachers exchanging worried glances, and the principal pacing his office like a man walking across thin ice. By noon, Leona Daniels was summoned. She walked the hall quietly, every step measured, her heels echoing against the tile in slow, steady rhythm. Students watched her pass like she was walking toward a verdict. Some looked at her with awe, others with pity, but none with understanding. They didn't know what it cost to keep calm, while someone tried to tear your dignity apart. When she entered the office, Principal Hardy sat behind his desk, his expression caught between discomfort and fear. And beside him, in an expensive gray suit and a cold smile, was Councilman Richard Cole, Brandon's father. His gold cufflinks flashed as he gestured to the chair opposite him. "Miss Daniels," he said with practiced politeness, "you've caused quite a stir." She sat, back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap. "Your son laid hands on me," she replied evenly. "If I caused a stir, it was by defending myself." Hardy cleared his throat, avoiding her eyes. "Mr. Cole insists this can be handled quietly," he said. "He's very concerned about Brandon's emotional state." Leona's jaw tightened. Emotional state. That's what they called arrogance now. "And what about mine?" she asked softly. Her calm tone carried more power than shouting ever could. "What about the teacher who was insulted, provoked, and grabbed in front of her students?" Councilman Cole's smile faltered, but he recovered quickly. "Let's not make this about race, Miss Daniels," he said, the way men like him always said it when they'd already made it about race. "We're all on the same side here." That sentence hit her harder than any insult. She had heard it before. Back when she wore camouflage instead of cardigans, standing in deserts where same side meant survival until it didn't. Her mind flashed to the day her squad was ambushed in Helmand Province. The screams, the smoke, the radio static, the moment she pulled her best friend out of gunfire only to watch him die in her arms. She'd carried his dog tags ever since, tucked beneath her blouse, a piece of metal that felt heavier on days like this. She swallowed, steadying her voice. "You're right," she said finally. "We should handle this quietly." Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a slim folder. She set it on the principal's desk and slid it forward. "That's my service record," she said. Hardy blinked, confused, but opened it. Lines of text, medals, commendations, 12 years in active duty. Paratrooper. Instructor. Combat medic. There were photos too, Leona in uniform, standing tall beside soldiers half her size and twice her age, her eyes hard but proud. The room went still. Councilman Cole leaned back, his smirk fading as he skimmed the first page. "You were military?" he said quietly. "Why didn't you mention this before?" Leona's voice didn't waver. "Because it shouldn't matter. But since you've decided to question my character, you deserve to know who you're trying to intimidate." Hardy shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Even he couldn't hide the flicker of respect or fear on his face. Leona continued, her tone steady but filled with years of weariness. "I came here to teach because I wanted to believe I could help build people instead of burying them. I wanted to believe this place was different. But the battlefield just changed uniforms. Now it's young men with entitlement instead of rifles, and people in offices too afraid to do what's right." The councilman opened his mouth, but nothing came out. There was no argument left to give, no shield of influence strong enough to withstand truth. She stood slowly, her movements precise, and looked him in the eye. "Tell your son I won't be filing a report. I've seen enough punishment in my lifetime. But if he ever crosses that line again, I'll remind him, respect isn't inherited. It's earned. Then she turned to leave. Outside, the hallway was empty, the world oddly still. She walked toward her classroom, her reflection stretching long across the polished floor. For the first time since joining Redmond Secondary, she felt exposed, not because of fear, but because she had revealed the part of herself she had sworn to keep buried. The soldier. The survivor. The woman who had seen the worst of humanity and still believed in teaching it to be better. That afternoon, a quiet shift rippled through the school. Students whispered differently now. The rumor wasn't about a teacher who lost her temper. It was about a woman who once jumped out of planes, patched bullet wounds, and still had the grace to stand tall when a boy with a silver spoon tried to humiliate her. Brandon walked through the hallways with his head down. His confidence cracked, the smirk gone. For the first time he looked unsure of where he fit in the world. And somewhere deep inside her, Leona felt something she hadn't in a long time, peace, fragile but real. It wasn't triumph, not revenge. Just the quiet relief of knowing she hadn't broken her promise to herself. She had faced another battle and chosen restraint over rage, wisdom over war. But she also knew it wasn't over. Redemption, like healing, takes time. And some lessons must scar before they're remembered. The weeks that followed felt different, quieter, as if the very walls of Redmond Secondary were still absorbing what had happened. Students moved through the halls with lowered voices, their laughter softer, their eyes sharper. The gossip had burned out, replaced by something else, respect. It wasn't loud or performative. It showed in the way students sat straighter when Miss Daniels entered a room, in the silence that followed her lessons, in the understanding that she wasn't just another teacher collecting paychecks and patience. She was something solid, someone they could no longer dismiss. But the one who changed most was Brandon Cole. He still came to class, though the swagger that used to announce him was gone. His eyes stayed low, his voice subdued. The first few days after the meeting, he avoided her gaze completely, sitting in the back, pretending to take notes. Yet even silence became its own kind of penance. Leona noticed but said nothing. She didn't humiliate him, didn't bring up what happened. She simply taught, day after day, as if trust could be rebuilt the same way strength was, in quiet repetition. But there were moments when she caught him glancing at her with something that wasn't anger anymore. It was something closer to understanding. One rainy afternoon, the class ended late. The other students hurried out, leaving only Brandon gathering his books in silence. Leona was wiping the board when she heard his voice, small, uncertain. "Miss Daniels." She turned and for the first time, saw the boy stripped of the arrogance that had armored him. He swallowed hard before continuing. "I just wanted to say, I was wrong." The words came out uneven, trembling with honesty. "I didn't know who you were. I didn't know." He trailed off, his throat tightening. "I'm sorry." Leona looked at him for a long moment. Her expression softened, not forgiving, not entirely, but recognizing the courage it took to speak. She nodded once, her tone calm but weighted. "Apologies don't erase what's been done, Brandon. But they're where change begins. The question is what you'll do after." He nodded, eyes glassy, then gathered his things and left. When the door closed behind him, she exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that carries both exhaustion and hope. Outside, the rain had eased into a mist. Through the window, she watched Brandon walk across the courtyard, his shoulders hunched but his pace steady. Maybe he'd carry this lesson further than the others. Maybe he'd remember what it felt like to be silenced by his own arrogance and finally understand the weight of the respect he'd tried to steal. She hoped so, because deep down she didn't want to break her students. She wanted to build them into people who'd never need to apologize like that again. The next week, Principal Hardy stopped by her classroom after hours. He leaned against the doorframe, his usual bluster replaced by something gentler. "I just wanted to say," he began awkwardly, "you handled that situation better than most would have. The board's decided not to pursue anything further. Mr. Cole has agreed to fund new lab equipment for your department." She smiled faintly, understanding the irony. "Sometimes growth costs money," she said quietly. "Sometimes it costs pride." He nodded, not quite catching the double meaning, and left her to her thoughts. When she finally locked up, the sun was setting over Redmond, turning the schoolyard gold. She walked across the lot, her bag slung over her shoulder, her steps unhurried. For the first time in months, the world felt still, not because everything was fixed, but because something small and good had survived. She reached the gate and paused, the evening wind brushing through her hair. From her pocket, she pulled the old dog tags, the metal cool against her palm. She whispered the names engraved there, a quiet promise to keep honoring what they'd stood for: courage, integrity, restraint. As she slipped them back into her coat, a familiar voice called out behind her, "Miss Daniels." Brandon jogged toward her, slightly out of breath. "I joined the community service group," he said quickly, almost embarrassed. "Thought you should know. We're organizing a drive for veterans next month." She smiled, a small genuine curve of the lips that said more than words could. "That's a good start," she replied. "Just make sure you're doing it for the right reasons." He nodded. "I am," he said quietly. "Because of you." She didn't reply. She didn't need to. He left, and she stood there for a long time, watching the orange light fade behind the rooftops. There was something healing in that silence, something earned. Not through power or fear, but through the slow, painful work of understanding. In her chest, the heaviness she'd carried since the day he first insulted her finally began to lift. As she walked away, the last line of her own lesson echoed in her mind, the one she'd written on the board earlier that day. Respect isn't about who speaks the loudest. It's about who listens when it matters most. And that, she thought, was what teaching really was, not about grades or rules, but about the quiet victories that no one claps for. Before you scroll away, tell me this: do you believe people like Brandon can truly change? Or are some lessons learned only once it's too late? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I really want to know how you see it. And if this story moved you, hit that like button to show your support. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that respect can't be bought. And subscribe for more powerful stories that prove strength isn't in revenge, it's in restraint.